It's good to see you all out tonight. Glad to see that you are wanting to hear more of God's Word. And so if you'll turn with me to Deuteronomy 6, that's mostly where we'll be tonight. Actually, we'll be there in a minute, but before that, turn to Matthew 22. So if you want to mark Deuteronomy 6. As Ryan said this morning, the Bible is a big book. So don't we just sometimes wish that we could just boil it down to one point? Like we could just understand the one thing that's the most important and take that away from it. And Jesus pretty much does that for us in Matthew 22. Matthew 22, starting in verse 34. It says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets.'" So Jesus tells us what the greatest commandment is. He says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And he also says, on these two commandments, loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself, depend all the law and the prophets. So essentially, this is the most important thing in the Old Testament, maybe even in the Bible. And so Jesus quotes this from Deuteronomy 6, if you'd like to turn there. And I think we've heard this so many times that, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might, that we kind of just lose what that means. Like we just hear, I know I'm supposed to love the Lord with all my heart, all my soul, all my mind. But if Jesus is saying this is the greatest commandment, then we really need to know what it means. And more than that, we need to do it. We need to live it. And so that's our goal for this evening, to know the greatest commandment, to know what it means, and to know what it means for us so that we can live it. So here in Deuteronomy, just a little bit of context, the book of Deuteronomy as a whole is Moses' address to a new generation of Israel as they're about to go into the promised land. And he's urging them not to repeat the mistakes of their parents, of being unfaithful to the Lord. And so his point is that they need to know their covenant with God. They need to know his promises. They need to know his blessings and how to receive them. And they need to know his curses and how to avoid them. And so the major section here in Deuteronomy, breaking it down from the book to the major section down to the chapter that we're about to be in, chapters 4 through 11 in Deuteronomy here is kind of this call to covenant faithfulness that Moses gives to the people. In chapter 4, he commands obedience. In chapter 5, he reminds them of the 10 Commandments. In chapter 6, he tells them the greatest command, which is what we're going to look at today. In chapter 7, he tells them that God chose them to be his people. In chapter 8, he warns them to remember God when they are living large in the promised land. In chapter 9, he tells them why God is giving them this land, not because of their righteousness, but because of the wickedness of the nations. In chapter 10, he tells them that their hearts need to be transformed to be like God's. And in chapter 11, he concludes that they need to love and serve the Lord. So this is the context for what we're going to be looking at tonight. But this immediate context, Deuteronomy 6, verses 1 through 3, says, "Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey." So this is the commandment from the Lord that Moses is giving them, that they may do them in the promised land. And so he says that you may also fear the Lord your God. This is supposed to be passed on through generations to you, your children, and your grandchildren. And they're supposed to keep these commandments all the days of their life. And that way their days may be long and God would bless them. And then in verse 3 he says, hear and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you and that you may multiply greatly as the Lord promised you. So that's the context for what we're looking at. In this first section, or this first verse of the main text that we have for tonight, which is Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9, in verse 4, we have this first word, which is hear. And the Hebrew word is Shema. This section, verses 4 through 9, I didn't know this before. I was doing a lot of research on this passage, and I found out that this is a prayer that Jewish people have said for long time, that they would pray in the morning and evening to remind them of their commitment to God. And so it starts with this first word, which is hear. And a little bit of a background real quick was this prayer that the Jews used to say. And the interesting thing is this word for hear has kind of a variety of meanings. It can mean to hear. As we have here in Proverbs 20, verse 12, it says, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. And so that seems simple enough, but there's a lot of other ways it's used rather than just sound waves entering your ear. It can also mean to pay attention to or focus on. In Genesis 29 and verse 33, it says, Leah conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. And that word Simeon comes from the same word, I guess, here, Shema, that the Lord has heard. He's paid attention to. He's seen that she was hated. And so some Bibles will have a footnote that says that Simeon sounds like the Hebrew word for heard. And so this word can mean to hear or pay attention to, but it can also mean to respond to what you hear. This is why so many of the cries for help in the Psalms begin with a call for God to hear or listen. Psalm 27 verse 7 says, hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. Psalm 30 verse 10, hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my helper. So asking God to hear, asking God to Shema, is at the same time asking God to respond, asking him to do something, to act. And it's like when God asks his people to listen. In Exodus 19 in verse 5, he says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. There's a few interesting things about this verse. Again, it's Exodus 19 verse 5. In this verse, notice you didn't hear the word hear or listen. In this verse, it's translated as obey. And also it's repeated. He says, if you will indeed obey. So in this Hebrew word is repeated twice. It's actually Shema, Shema in this sentence, and it's for emphasis, that if you will indeed obey, or if you will carefully listen. So from God's point of view, listening is basically the same thing as keeping the covenant. So when God asks his people to hear, what he means is that they listen and obey. And when we see the word obey in the Old Testament, it's this word, Shema. Some examples of that would be Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 and 2, chapter 30, verses 2, 8, 10, and 20. Like lots of times it's used as obey when it's the same word here. So in the Bible, if someone is going to say, I will listen and do what you say, they would say this word, Shema. So listening and obeying are two sides of the same coin. And the application of that should be kind of clear for us, that we can't claim to listen to God and not do what he says. Just like the prophets would say about Israel, when they weren't faithful to God, they have ears, but they don't hear. In Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 21, he says that. The Israelites, of course, they could hear just fine. It wasn't wrong with their hearing, but they weren't actually listening because they weren't obeying. And so this first part of the greatest command that we're looking at is not to just hear God, but to also do what he says. Which brings us to our next word. I missed the last translation of that. The next word, key word in this passage, is the word for Lord, or Yahweh. And so this is the personal name of the God of Israel. The first time we learn about this word is the story of Moses in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 13. Exodus 3 verse 13, it says, "Then Moses said to God, 'If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?' And God said to Moses, 'I am who I am.' And he said, 'Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you.'" So God tells Moses he is going to use him to deliver the people out of Egypt, out of slavery in Egypt. We know this story. And Moses wonders, well, what if the people ask me who you are? What if they ask me who is the God, the name of the God that has sent me? And so God responds with this, "I am who I am." He says, "Tell them I am has sent me to you." And this word I am is actually the Hebrew word ehyeh, which just means I am or I will be. Some of your translations might have a footnote that says, instead of I am who I am, it could be translated I am what I am or I will be what I will be. Basically, God's name means that he is the one who is and who will be. And so God's existence doesn't depend on anyone or anything else. He simply is. And it would sound strange for Moses to say, well, I am or I will be has sent me to you. So in the next sentence, verse 15, God tells him what he should tell them. Verse 15 says, "God also said to Moses, 'Say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations.'" So God tells him what he should tell them, that the Lord, and what he says here is Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. And this is the personal name of the God of Israel, Yahweh. And it appears over 6,500 times in the Old Testament. But back in Deuteronomy 6, Moses said, "The Lord," this word here, Yahweh, our God, the Lord is one. And this can also be translated a few different ways. The reason we're going over this, like, why does it matter what this is saying here? Well, you might have a footnote that points this out. What this is really saying is Yahweh, or the Lord, is our God, Yahweh alone. So it's not quite as clear when it says the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But what it's saying, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. So we know that Yahweh is the only God, and that he is the God of Israel in the Old Testament, and that means they shouldn't worship any other gods. It's the Lord alone, and that was the first commandment he gives them. And again, this is the greatest commandment. We shouldn't have any other gods. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And that brings us to the next word. Those are the two translations of that. The next word is love. You shall love the Lord your God. And this word is ahava in chapter 6, verse 5. We're supposed to love the Lord our God. And this word also has a variety of meanings, or a deeper meaning than just what we kind of see on the surface. Most basically, it refers to the affection or care one person shows another. Sometimes that's physical affection, like the king of Persia shows love for Queen Esther. In Esther 2, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women. And just a quick note, a different Hebrew word is used in the Old Testament for physical desire or sexual love, so that's not what this word means. That's not what it's talking about. This word is more broad. It can mean a parental love. In Genesis 22, verse 2, God said, "Take your son," this is to Abraham, "your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go." So that's parental love. And it can also mean brotherly love. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 1, "The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul." A group of people can even have love for their leader, like when the Israelites show love for their King David in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 16. But all Israel and Judah loved David. And it can even describe loyalty between political allies. 1 Kings 5 verse 1. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram always loved David. And the Bible often talks about God's love, or God's ahava. In Deuteronomy, Moses tells Israel that God chose to love them. Deuteronomy 7 verses 7 and 8. It was not because you are more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, but it is because the Lord loves you. So God doesn't love because they earned it or deserved it, but because that's his character. As John says in 1 John 4 verse 8, God is love. And so that's why Jeremiah can say that God's love is everlasting. In Jeremiah 31 verse 3, I have loved you with an everlasting love. It has no end or beginning. Just like God himself, his love just is and will be. And it's not a duty or obligation God has. It's a genuine feeling. Hosea compares God's love to his people. He compares it to a husband's love for his wife. Hosea 3 verse 1, and the Lord said to Hosea, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man, and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. He also compares God's love to a parent's love for their child. Hosea 11 verse 1, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Love is one of the strongest things God feels. But God's love isn't just a feeling. It's also an action. Deuteronomy 4 verse 37, and because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them and brought you out of Egypt with his own presence by his great power. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. These are passages that we're familiar with about God's love isn't just a way he feels, it's something he does for us. It's not just a sentiment. And so love is an action. And in this passage here in Deuteronomy 6, in the Shema, the greatest command, Israel is called to respond to God's love by showing love in return. Again, we're supposed to love the Lord our God. In Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our might. And just like God's love, our love should show itself through actions. In Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 through 13, it says, and now Israel, what does the Lord require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. We are supposed to show that love back for God in our actions. These are action words. They're centered around love. Therefore, if I'm not doing these things, I don't really love God. I just say I do. Which leads to one last thing about this word, love. I show my love for God by how I treat people around me. In Deuteronomy 10, just down a couple verses, verses 18 and 19, he executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So God's people are supposed to imitate his love by showing love for others. And this is the reason that it's important for us to know this, is because this is what Jesus refers to as the second greatest commandment, to love my neighbor as myself. In fact, we can't truly keep the greatest commandment if we don't keep the second. And so at the end of the day, all of this is rooted in God's own eternal love. Like we read in 1 John, we love because he first loved us, in 1 John 4, verse 19. And this brings us to the next part of the greatest command, what we're supposed to love God with. The first thing listed is our heart, and this is the Hebrew word lev. But first, we need to understand what that means, because we'd probably say, well, of course, I'm supposed to love God with my heart. What else would I love him with? And we have to understand that the ancient understanding of heart was kind of different than we understand it today. People throughout history have actually had a lot of different conceptions of how the human body works and what the heart does, and so ancient Israel was no exception to that. So what did they think about the heart? Well, first of all, they knew that the heart was an organ that sustains life. There's mention of a heart attack in 1 Samuel 25, verse 37. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as stone. But the Bible also talks about the heart in a lot of ways that would seem kind of strange to us. And that's because they didn't really have a concept of what we call our brain. They didn't really understand that. And so they imagined that all of a human's intellectual activity, their thinking, your mind, would take place in the heart. So essentially, they thought that your heart was your mind and the intellectual activity. For example, you know things with your heart. To them, your heart is where you understand. Proverbs 14, verse 33, wisdom rests in the heart of a man of understanding. 1 Kings 10:24, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Mind here is the same word translated heart. And so the heart is where you think, and it's where you make sense of the world, but it's also where you feel emotions. You can experience the pain of sadness in your heart, like Hannah, it said how she, in 1 Samuel 1, verses 7 and 8, therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? You can also experience fear in your heart. It can melt or be distressed or depressed. Joshua 2, verse 11, something that Rahab says about her people, as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man when they heard about what God had done and how Israel was coming for them. And kind of on the flip side, our heart is where we experience joy and happiness. Judges 16, verse 25, and when their hearts were merry. Jeremiah 15, verse 16, and your words became to me a joy and the delight of my heart. So the heart is a generator of physical life, and it's also the center of our intellectual and emotional life, but there's even more to that. The heart is where you make decisions motivated by your desires. David had it in his heart to build a temple for God in 2 Samuel 7. It's also where your affections or your desires are centered. We see that from there as well. In Psalm 37, they're called the desires of your heart. And if you really want something and go after it, like David did, whatever is in your heart, go and do it. That's in our heart as well. And that's in 2 Samuel 7. So then, in the Bible, the heart is the center of all parts of human existence. As it says in Proverbs, keep your heart, for from it flow the springs of life. Proverbs 4, verse 23. And so a major theme in the Old Testament is how our hearts need to be transformed. Jeremiah says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? He had watched a whole generation turn away from God. They even started sacrificing their children as if that were a good thing. So the Old Testament prophets make it clear that the human heart must be totally renewed. David in Psalm 51, verse 10, after he committed murder and adultery, he says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Jeremiah 31, verse 33, Jeremiah says, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 36, verse 26, says, and I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and will give you a heart of soft flesh. Moses also says in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And so that's really similar to what we're talking about here in Deuteronomy 6. He uses the same language. And he also had talked about this earlier in Deuteronomy chapter 10 when talking about loving the sojourner, that our hearts need to be circumcised. But it brings us back to this text in Deuteronomy 6 that every day God's people are called to devote to God their whole body, their feelings, their mind and desires. And that's what it means to love God with all your heart. And so until we allow our hearts to be transformed, just like Moses was saying in Deuteronomy 30 in verse 6, we cannot fulfill this greatest command. But our hearts are not the only thing we're called to love God with. The next word is soul, which in Hebrew is nephesh. But just like the heart, this word was different for us than it was for them. The English word soul comes with a lot of baggage from ancient Greek philosophy. It's the idea that the soul is this non-physical, immortal essence of a person that's trapped in their body and released after death. But that's not really what this Hebrew word means. That's not what nephesh means. The most common meaning is the whole person. Like in Genesis, there were 33 nephesh in Jacob's family. That is 33 people in Genesis 46, verse 15. In Numbers, a murderer is someone who kills a nephesh. And in Deuteronomy, a kidnapper is someone who steals a nephesh. On the first pages of the Bible, both humans and animals are called a living nephesh, or a living being, a living creature. And if the life breath has left a human or animal, the nephesh remains. It's just called a dead nephesh. That is a corpse. That's in Numbers 9 and verse 10. So in the Bible, people don't have a soul. They don't have a nephesh. They are a soul, a living, breathing, physical being. It's their entire being. In fact, this is why people in the Bible often use this word to refer to themselves, and it gets translated me or I. Like in Psalm 119, most translations read, "Let me live, that I may praise you," in verse 175. But in Hebrew, it says, "Let my nephesh live, that it may praise you." He's talking about his soul, his whole being. And so by using this word, he's emphasizing that his entire being, his life and his body, offers praise to God. And in the Song of Songs, the young woman constantly refers to her lover as the one my soul, or the one my nephesh loves. And of course, love isn't just an intellectual experience. It's an emotion that activates our whole body, our whole being. The psalmist could even combine multiple meanings of this word in one place. Like in Psalm 42, we read about, "As the deer pants for the water, so my soul," nephesh, "pants after you. My soul thirsts for the living God." So on a physical level, you can be thirsty like a deer, but then that physical thirst can become a metaphor for how your whole being longs to know and be known by God. Which brings us all the way back to Deuteronomy 6. Again, to love God with all your soul means to devote your whole physical existence to Him. It's about offering my whole self, my entire being, with all my capabilities and limitations in the effort to love God. And that brings us to the third way we're to love God, with all of our strength, or my translation says with all of your might. And this is the word miod. And this is used about 300 times in the Old Testament. The interesting thing I found was it doesn't actually really mean strength. There is a perfectly good word for strength in Hebrew, which I found out. I didn't know any of this really before. But it's like when it talks about Samson's strength or God's power, and this word is not the word it uses when it talks about those things. In fact, Deuteronomy 6 is one of the only places that this word is translated as strength. So what's up with that? The most common meaning of this is very or greatly. This is what a grammar nerd like me would call an adverb. It's unlike heart and soul, which are nouns. This is an adverb, which means it's there to augment other words. For example, in Genesis 1, God looks at the world He's made, and 6 times He calls it good, But then the seventh time, he says it is very good. And that's this word in front of good, miod. It's very good. It's miod good. Later in Genesis, in the story of Noah, the floodwaters increase greatly, or increase miod. In the story of Cain and Abel, Cain wasn't just angry at his brother, he was very angry, and that's this word there. And so like we saw with the first word for here, this word can also be used together twice in a verse. And when it is, it's like increasing that word to full capacity. Genesis 30 and verse 43, it says, "Thus Jacob increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, camels and donkeys." In Hebrew, it says he increased exceedingly greatly, or miod miod. Or when the Israelite spies went to investigate the promised land and said, "The land we passed through is an exceedingly good land." In Hebrew, again, it's this word twice there. It's an exceedingly great good land. So it's used to go to the full capacity of what that word means. And it's pretty clear this word doesn't just mean strength in terms of muscle power, but rather very or much. Back in Deuteronomy 6, people are called to love God with all of their heart, that is their will and their affections, with all of their soul, that is their whole life and being, and with all of their miod, that is with all of their, this is a weird word, muchness. That's essentially what it's saying there. And that's kind of funny, but we also kind of understand it. This is with everything we have. So if this word can intensify any word's meaning to total capacity, then this final thing that we use to love God isn't a thing at all. Loving God with all your miod means devoting every possibility, opportunity, and capacity you have to Him. It's incredibly wide and expansive, and it can refer to almost anything. So when Jesus quoted this passage, he replaced the word strength, or might, as my translation says, with mind and strength. You see that in Mark chapter 12. And so, it kind of makes us think, what is the right interpretation of this word? I'm someone who, I like things to be a certain way. I'm very picky about how things are. And so I'm like, okay, well, what am I supposed to say? How's this word supposed to be translated? Is it strength, or is it power? Is it mind? What is it? And I think that's the wrong question. This word doesn't limit how we show love for God. To the contrary, the point is that everything in our lives offers the chance to love and serve God. It's not limiting. It's a call to love God with all of our muchness. And so in these last 3 verses show us how to do this. How do we love God with all our heart, soul, and might? And so verses 6 through 9, he says, "And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart." Verse 6. This is an internal manner. That is, it's on our minds. It's integrated with our feelings, and it's part of our decision making. Specifically, that means listening to and obeying God, ensuring that Yahweh is the one true God of my life, with whom I serve everything that I am. And in verse 7, he says, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." This is a family matter. We're supposed to teach our children these things, that Yahweh, God, is the one we must serve, and Him alone. That we are to love God with everything we are and everything we have. And how to do that, what it means, what it looks like. Those are the things we're supposed to teach our children. And we're supposed to talk about these things when we're home and when we're not home, from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep. Continuing in verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." We're supposed to talk about these things wherever we are. In other words, we're supposed to talk about these things all the time and everywhere. So, do we do that? Do we talk about who God is and how we are to obey and love him? Do we talk about those things? Or do we just, as I'm often guilty of, just talk about sports or politics or movies or what we did that day? What are the things that we talk about in our home? What are the things we talk about when we're with our family or with whoever we're with? What do we talk about? And like I said, I'm guilty of all these things, and I certainly don't think or talk about God nearly as much as I should. But what if we did do that? What if we talked about him all the time? What would our homes look like? What would our lives look like? What things would we do that we aren't doing right now? What things would we not do that we are doing right now? What would our lives, what would be changed? What would be different? And remember, our hearts need to be transformed so that we can love God how we ought to, because our hearts are hard, they're stubborn, and they're sick. And so unless we fix them, or we allow God to fix them, we cannot keep this greatest command. And then verses 8 and 9, he says, "You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." And in the past, a lot of Jewish people had done this in a very literal way. They actually bound these things on their hands with scripture in them and wore them as frontlets or phylacteries on their foreheads, and they put them in these little boxes on the doorposts of their house. And that's one way we could take this passage. That's the way they've done it. But we can also go above and beyond that, because those aren't really bad things to do. It's not normal for us. But we can take the principle behind this and go even further, that this is a public matter. We are surrounded by people who need to hear God's word. We're surrounded by people who need to hear the words, "The Lord is our God, the Lord alone." Because they don't listen to or obey those words. They worship and obey other gods. They need to hear those words from us. We need to talk about them in public places. And just like Moses was warning and urging these people not to repeat the mistakes of their parents and the past generation, we also must not be like the nations around us or make the same mistakes of our parents. And I'm not talking about some specific, like, oh, they didn't talk about God enough. Really, that's probably true of all of us. We don't talk about God as much as we should. And so let's not keep repeating those mistakes. Let's learn from that. Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. These are the words that must be heard wherever we go, in the things that we do with our hands, the way that we see the world, and the places that we live, our homes and our towns, that all the world may know that wherever we are, in this place, the Lord alone is served. People need to know that. The world needs to see that. And so remember, this greatest command, this Shema, is a call for covenant faithfulness to the Lord. So now we know it. We know what it means. But what does it mean for us? And we've kind of started talking about that a little bit, and we're about out of time. But even though we don't have a lot more time to talk about it right now, we can talk about this, and we should talk about this. This doesn't end right here when we leave tonight. This is something we should talk about wherever we are. Because the most important thing this means for us is how this passage begins. We may hear these words, but if we don't obey, if we don't do them, then we aren't listening. Having ears, we hear not. And if I don't do these things, then I don't love God. I just say I do. And if that's the case, why are you here? Being here won't save you. As Ryan was talking about this morning, it's not enough to just come to church, check it off. It's not enough. And by now, we all know that. So what are we going to do about it? If there is something you would like to do tonight, right now, please let us know. We would love to help you, so please just let us know if there's anything we can do for you, if you would like to give your life to God, to love Him with all of your heart, all of your soul, and all your strength, to truly hear, to listen, and obey. If there's any way we can help you, please let us know while together we stand and sing.
Shall love the Lord thy God with all of thy heart, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy soul, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy strength, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy mind. Hear, O Israel, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy heart, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy soul, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy strength, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy mind. Hear, O Israel. Thank you, Bryce, for that lesson tonight. It's a wonderful reminder for all of us. Is there any here that was unable to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning? If you could raise your hand. That will be served in the back after our closing prayer. Before we have that prayer, we'll have one more song. God be with you till we meet again.